Welcome back, everyone. We're about to start on our next segment. We're going to be talking to Tristan Stewart today, who's the founder of Feedback, and also the founder of Toast Ale, a beer launched in the UK in 2016 that is made using fresh surplus blood. We're going to be talking about this sickening reality of food waste. Also joining us will be Dr. Brooke Hansen, who is the Director of Sustainable Tourism at the Patel College of Global Sustainability of the University of South Florida. But before we begin, I'd like to just share with you some statistics. 30% to 40% of all the food produced in this country is wasted every single year. In Florida alone, more than 5.6 million surplus food tons were generated, while more than 2.5 million people, including more than 700,000 children, were food insecure. Food waste reducing food waste is considered as the #1 personal action to reduce carbon emission, according to Project Drawdown. So for us, it was obviously of tremendous importance to bring this topic to light and talk about the scandalous food waste problem our country and our planet has. So without further ado, please welcome Tristan Stewart. Tristan.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So as we just heard, food waste is a colossal environmental problem. But I hope to emphasize in the next 10 to 15 minutes that it's also a colossal environmental opportunity. But to start with the big picture, food production is the single biggest negative impact that humans have on nature and on planet Earth. That has historically been the case for thousands of years, in fact, and it still remains the case. So that, when we think of transport and industry and pollution from the modern industrial kind of complex, it's very easy to forget that actually the basic activity of producing food outweighs in all environmental respects the impact that we have on nature. Now, obviously, feeding ourselves is absolutely essential, but the way in which we feed ourselves can be dramatically improved to reduce and indeed to reduce the negative environmental impact and increase the potential benefits that food production can bring. So yeah, just to lay out the bad news, it's food production is the single biggest cause of deforestation. It's the main reason why the Amazon is being chopped down. It's the main reason why Southeast Asia has been deforested, and indeed increasingly in Central Africa as well. The main reason why forests are being chopped down is not primarily for logging. It's primarily to increase the agricultural footprint, to extend the agricultural frontier into the world's remaining wild places, essentially for the purposes of growing more food. It's the main cause of soil erosion. It's by far the biggest user of fresh water. And indeed, it is the single biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions. And the problem that we face is that we're being told by some of the big corporations of the world, and indeed, I'm just going to share my screen now, if I can manage that. We're being told by some of the big corporations of the world that what we need to stave off global famine is not just to carry on as we are, but indeed to double food production by 2050 to feed those 9 to 10 billion people anticipated on planet Earth at that time. Now, if we already have a food system that is unsustainable, the idea of doubling that food system without putting in place robust measures to prevent the worst and most egregious impacts of the food system, we really will cook the planet and render it unable to feed ourselves. Indeed, this strategy, what I call the productionist paradigm, this idea that we need to double food production in order to stave off disaster, I would say it's the biggest threat there is, not just to the environment, but to long-term food security. And I think our main objective when we talk about the food system is to present the reasons and to essentially block the progress of this paradigm. I believe this paradigm is principally serving the interests of the profit generation of the large corporations that dominate the food system. And it's not been devised primarily in order to safeguard the welfare of the human population, let alone all the other species on planet Earth. And I've made it my life's work, essentially, to demonstrate that if we carry on deforesting the Earth to grow more food, our ability, yes, to feed ourselves and let alone leave enough space for any of the other species on Earth will be dramatically undermined. The good news is that we actually already know how to do food production in a way that can create habitat rather than to destroy it, to sequester water into aquifers rather than constantly depleting them. And most importantly, we know how to do farming in a way that can actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into soil, which is where it belongs. Indeed, that's what plants evolved to do billions of years ago, God bless them. And if we can harness the power of plants on our agricultural systems to suck that carbon in and then embed it long-term into our soils through biochar and compost and other means that are actually part of traditional and ancient agricultural practices, as well as parts of modern technological approaches to this problem, then I think that we have a really, really powerful toolkit to reduce and, as I say, begin to undo some of the most severe environmental problems that we face. And the food system is a wonderful place to do that, because there are some win-win-win opportunities. Take, for example, the issue that the biggest public health crisis on Earth, by far the biggest cause of morbidity on Earth, is actually the problem of overconsumption in rich countries. So that's the problem of obesity and diabetes and all of those health-related impacts of eating, frankly, too much food, and particularly too much of the most resource-intensive foods like meat and dairy products. So we know that the WHO say that in most rich countries, we eat way more meat and dairy products than is good for our own health. And those are the products that are most negatively impacting the environment. So if we can reduce the overconsumption of food in general, calories in general, and in particular those most resource-intensive food products, we can improve our own health, reduce the taxpayer liability that funds the health services and is impacted on when people are too unwell to go to work and contribute to the economy. If we can tackle that problem at the same time as saving planet Earth from the effects of overconsumption, the effects of producing and consuming more food than we need, then that's a really big win-win. And the other really huge win-win is the problem of food waste. And this chart kind of combines the problem of overconsumption and food waste into one. It shows how many calories are available in every country in the world, in the shops and restaurants that people buy their food from. And what it shows you is that all rich countries in North America and Western Europe have between 1.5 and 2 times the amount of food given as calories that they actually need to sustain a healthy diet. And therefore, rather than doubling food production globally, what we should be looking at is tackling that problem. We should be reducing the overconsumption, overproduction, and aggressive marketing of unhealthy, environmentally unsustainable foods in rich countries. That's where we can begin. It also happens to be, certainly from my perspective, a really good place to start, because it's starting from home. In addition to the simple calorific parameter of food availability, which the last chart showed, this shows the kind of indirect total amount of calories that are used to produce the surpluses. In other words, this includes the calories that are in the crops that people nowadays grow specifically for the purposes of feeding to livestock to increase meat and dairy production. And whilst this talk is mainly about food waste as commonly understood, namely the food that we throw away, the waste of calories, the waste of nutrition that is embedded within the meat and dairy production systems of the modern industrial food complex is also a form of food waste. Indeed, we waste about 1,100 calories of food per day for every single person on the planet through feeding grains and pulses that we could eat ourselves to livestock. Now, I am myself not a vegetarian. I'm not an advocate for veganism or vegetarianism. I think there are some ways to produce meat and dairy products that are actually environmentally positive, but not many. And that means we have to dramatically reduce our consumption of those products if we want to have a sustainable food system. Now, I've kind of always seen the food system as both the biggest problem, but also the biggest opportunity for change. And I don't have a spiritual practice. I don't do yoga. I don't do meditation. But what I've found retrospectively, pretty much all of my work fits into what I call a spirit of companionship. Companion is my favorite word. Com is with, and pan is bread. And a companion is somebody you share food with. And here we have some bonobos, our closest animal relatives, sharing food. And in fact, bonobos are a real lesson to us. They, when they have surplus food, they will go out and find other bonobos to share that food with, in preference to wasting it. Essentially, they go out and make new friends, and they will prefer to share their food with a stranger who they don't know than with somebody who's already a friend. Essentially, they're turning their surplus food into social capital to make new friends. And I always think, you know, the 1.3 billion tons of food that humans waste every year, that's a huge environmental impact, but it's also a colossal waste of friendship. But what could we do? How many friends could we make if, instead of wasting that food, we found ways of sharing it with other people through good companionship? And this works on a domestic level. You know, if we have some leftovers, save it for the next day and eat it for our own lunch, or share it with our friends. If you have a slice of pizza left over in the box, don't chuck it away. Give it to the person sitting next to you. You might get a smile, and pandemics allowing, you might even get a hug, like we see here. And this sharing of food to make friendship, it's not a unique bonobo activity. Indeed, it is a universal human behavior. The sharing of food to make friendship, to build society, essentially, is found in every single culture in the world. It's one of the very few cultural practices that is genuinely universal. And I think that through the spirit of good companionship, we have the opportunity to undo most of the most really damaging impacts of the environment. Food waste is one of the obvious ones. So all of this food that we currently throw away, shops, restaurants, growers like this Peruvian tangerine grower who's throwing away 1,000 tons of tangelos into the desert, burying it. This is in a country in Peru where hundreds of thousands of children are malnourished. This is really bad companionship. And the supermarket, it's a UK supermarket that was buying this fruit and having the grower grow it, is really ultimately responsible for this bad companionship, because it was they that put the cosmetic standards that said that these absolutely minor skin defects that have no impact on quality or longevity of the fruit, and it's just a visual thing, that anything with those skin blemishes needs to be thrown away. Anything that's 1 or 2 millimeters too small needs to be thrown away. Now, that's really bad companionship, and it is our responsibility to make sure that the businesses we're giving our food to every day do not embed such environmentally destructive and socially unjust policies onto the growers that are producing that food. Same thing with these bananas. They're all the wrong shape or size for the European supermarkets for whom they're being grown in Ecuador. And farmers universally are having to outgrade thousands and thousands of tons of these perfectly good fruits and vegetables to grow food. Now, there has been a huge transformation in the issue of food waste over the last 10 to 20 years, which really does show that with a bit of energy, we can actually bring about dramatic change. Here in the United Kingdom, where I started campaigning on this issue 20 years ago, and where I started doing Feeding the 5,000 campaigns all over the country, and then eventually around the world, galvanizing a movement against food waste, we've managed to reduce consumer food waste in households by 1/3 since these campaigns began. Now, that is not enough, but it does demonstrate mass behavior change is very difficult to achieve. And there are very few environmental campaigns that can demonstrate that level of voluntary behavior change for an environmental cause. And food waste has really proved to be one that has galvanized the chefs who are kind of demonstrate what can be done on TV shows. It's galvanized policymakers who have put in money to educate and inspire customers to reduce their own food waste, and to put pressure on the big retailers and the manufacturers to commit to reducing their food waste. So there's been this cross-sectoral, civic society-run, government supported universal campaign against food waste, and it's proved to be extremely effective across the board. And I believe that this sort of thing is good companionship in action, and I think we can all play a part in it. It's good fun, it's celebratory, it's inspiring, and it works across societies. And I think that yeah, the issue of food waste, because it is one that can be used to inspire people towards positive action that we can interact with on a daily basis, whether it's in our own homes when we open our fridges, or when we go to the supermarket and pay at the till for the groceries that we're buying, we can have an impact. And I mentioned the entrepreneurial kind of energy and buzz there is around food waste. Now, no matter where you live in the world, you've probably got access to some of the great businesses that have popped up. Over in the US, I had the great pleasure of meeting and indeed introducing some of the directors of Imperfect Produce, now a company serving hundreds of thousands of customers across California with those ugly fruit and vegetables that used to be wasted. It's now a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the founders have turned this kind of bad practice into a colossal business opportunity. And there are now dozens of companies working along similar lines. Olio, which is helping people share surplus food from their own homes. Let's say they're going on holiday and they don't want to chuck away the contents of their fridge. They upload it onto the app and their neighbors can come and help themselves for free. Or Too Good To Go, which is buzzing around the United States now, having been a huge success for years in Europe. And that's helping retailers and food service companies sell off at a discount any surplus food that would otherwise be wasted. And I've had the great pleasure over the years of knowing some of the most successful founders of these companies, and it's been an inspiration. I set up my own company along these lines back in 2016. It's called Toast Ale, and it was born from the anger that I experienced when I saw 13,000 slices of fresh bread that you can see here being thrown away from a single sandwich factory. And the reason for that is because it's the end slice and the slice just before the end slice of the loaf, which people don't want in their sandwiches allegedly. So they're all just being chucked away. I learned that the ancient origins of beer production was actually to use waste grains and bread that would otherwise have been wasted, and to ferment it into this long shelf life product, which we now call beer. Thank the ancient Sumerians and Babylonians for creating this beverage, the preservation of the calories being the principal objective. Fermentation is a preservation technology. The inebriation that can result is a happy side effect. And you know, when I started in 2016, this is Jamie Oliver drinking the first ever bottle, and he drank it on television. He really liked it, and that created this wonderful business, Toast Ale, which, in my view, is liquid companionship. It's a way of celebrating these positive celebratory solutions, of bringing people together around the solutions that we can adopt on a daily basis, on a geopolitical basis, across the food system. And I think it's one of the things that we can all do to transform the food system from the biggest negative impact that we have on planet Earth to potentially the most powerful asset we have to restore nature through good diet, a good nutritional food availability for everyone that leaves no one hungry, and that leaves the earth in a better state than we found it. So thank you very much, and I look forward to lots of challenges and discussion now that I've finished talking.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and inspirational as always. You're such a global asset to us in the food waste war. And as we all know, we need to stop calling it food waste, right? It's a food resource or food residual, but we keep the lingo up until people get on with the project. And I just wanted to have a conversation with you about some additional angles to the food waste conundrum and what we can do about it. The pandemic has certainly demonstrated to many people that we have some serious issues in our food supply chain. And I think probably for the first time in a very long time, maybe even decades, middle and upper income families have gone to supermarkets and seen no food. So they have experienced this issue of not having enough food and maybe are becoming a little more frugal. Well, as the pandemic maybe starts winding to a close, at least this chapter, and food gets back on the shelves again, how do we keep this in the consciousness of people that we have serious food waste system issues and issues of excess and want? Any strategies for keeping the momentum going that we kind of started as a silver lining of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think you're right that there was a silver lining. I mean, people were cooking from scratch at home a great deal more than they were, and this is a really valuable way of making us appreciate food more. And speaking for myself, I mean, as somebody who's always liked good companionship, one of the things I missed most in the pandemic was just having my friends around for a meal. That sharing of food, it's really my love language, if you like, is the sharing of food with friends. And I'm actually having some people round for dinner tonight. We'll be eating my homegrown winter vegetables from the garden and some roadkill venison, and all, you know, food produced in the most sustainable way. And that narrative is a way of kind of weaving us all together into the social fabric. And I think that I'm not alone in having missed that acutely during the pandemic. And I think a lot of the surveys that were going out in the early days of the pandemic were demonstrating that people were very mindful of that. Now, it is the case, you know, that when things return to normal, there's a slippage. But I think there are good reasons to believe that, having been reminded of something that is very important, the value of food, the value of using food to its utmost potential, that it doesn't vanish immediately. Indeed, if you look at the impacts of, say, the Second World War, when rationing made populations across Europe, and indeed also in America, but particularly in Europe, very, very acutely aware of the value of food. People who lived through that generation are still very mindful of, you know, it doesn't take one's grandmother very much prompting to start talking about what it was like during rationing. And I hope that, in a way, the experience of the pandemic will remain a kind of touchstone that reminds us of that these things can't be taken for granted. And I think you ask what are the strategies for making sure that this remains the case. I think keeping it alive in conversation in our culture, that is essentially what culture is the sharing and evolution of ideas peer to peer. We're a very peer-driven animal. The humans, we like companionship. We like to be respected and to be liked by our peers. And if we keep this value alive in our culture, I think we will help each other be part of this evolution or transformation of our food practices.
So through our companionship and through our conversation, we're going to keep our eyes on the prize and not forget what we learned during the pandemic. We don't seem to be so good at learning from history, but we're going to try with this one, I think. And I know that Feedback has been very committed to gleaning. And during these times when shelves were empty all over the world, do you have any idea of how the gleaning networks fared during the pandemic? Did they increase? Do we have any metrics on the role of gleaning during the pandemic?
So I should just clarify as a formality, really, but just to say I did found the organization Feedback, but I handed over the reins in 2017. I'm not directly responsible or involved in the day-to-day running of the organization. I remain its biggest fan. I also founded, as has been mentioned, the business Toesdale, and we give money from Toesdale to Feedback and other charities like it. So I'm still a huge supporter. I know that the Feedback's Gleaning network has spread across the United Kingdom. That, as you say, you know, as people became aware that there were crops being left in the fields and not even harvested, there was a kind of an urge to go and get some of that food. I was involved in some of that because when the pandemic first struck, Toesdale decided to dedicate all of its profits to feeding people who had suddenly fallen into food poverty and food insecurity during the pandemic. And we worked with an organization called Food for All, cooking up thousands of meals every day and getting that to people's doors so they didn't have to come out. And the food that we were using was surplus food from the food industry, some of which was gleaned fruit and vegetables. I mean, that said, gleaning is as much about demonstrating the nature of the problem as it is about genuinely providing a long-term systemic solution to the problem. The solution is that we should stop throwing away a third of a harvest because it doesn't look good, or because a supermarket has decided to cancel an order at the last minute. And you know, that was certainly for me the primary objective of founding the Gleaning network back in the day. Is to really shine a spotlight on the causes with a view to changing the policies, and any gleaning activities that go on, which obviously have a very local benefit, providing healthy food for charities that might otherwise not be able to afford it. It's kind of its ability to change the system is where the great benefits potentially are.
And as you say, culture is so foundational to all of these issues and changing them. I lived in Hawaii for a long time, and I would drive around and I would see people with fruit trees, and the fruit was just dropping and laying on the ground, not being used. Other people noticed that too. And the best example I've seen of a really effective gleaning network was the Hawaii Ulu Cooperative, paying people a pretty good price per pound for breadfruit. And almost everyone's got a breadfruit tree in their yard in Hawaii, and they took that breadfruit and they processed it and they got it into the schools and started giving healthy meals. And here in Florida, we drive around right now and the loquats are becoming ripe. No one's harvesting them, they're just falling on the ground. We do have an informal loquat gleaning network here in Florida to try to get those loquats. So we need to change people's perception to see food falling from trees and rotting on the ground is something that we should collect, and we should make jam, and we should share, right? And have that companionship.
Yeah, and it's such an empowering thing. I mean, I have a very informal annual weekend every year. We do exactly what you've just described. We go around all the local villages and gardens, shaking the apple trees of people who simply don't harvest all their apples. They make maybe 2 or 3 apple pies, but you know, unless you're making 200 or 300 apple pies or preserving the apples in a really meticulous way, as I do with my own apples, you know, these apples go to waste. So we harvest them all, we bring them back to our farm, we invite everyone, it's an open weekend, and everyone presses the apple juice, and we pasteurize half of that apple juice so we can drink it throughout the year, and the rest we just leave it in great big vats to ferment and turn into hard cider, which is free and beautiful, natural, just juice for the year. And it's such a wonderful way of connecting with nature and with one's neighbors and the soil and the earth, and the idea that this can be done with stuff that would otherwise be wasted, incredibly empowering and inspiring and delicious and nutritious, and means I don't have to go to the supermarket and buy any of these products. And the more of that community level gleaning and recovery and sharing that we can do, the more human we are, I think.
And it used to be that way in the old days, as we know. So really going back to a lot of old techniques and old forms of companionship that we had. So we know culture is important, but policy is important too. And I know that you've worked very hard on educating people about that and championing the policy perspective. And right now, last I checked in America, we have 7 states that have passed laws about food waste, mostly geared to retailers, which is fine. And I definitely think we need a lot more. You're probably aware that we have a national bill right now, HR 3652, the National Food Waste Reduction Act. So what are your thoughts on where we're at with the rest of the world on policies to reduce and prevent food waste?
Well, thank you so much. By the way, you cut out then. Am I still audible?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
So thank you so much, because I think only so much can be done by individual action and by behavior change, and expecting just voluntary cultural shifts to save planet Earth by itself without the policy backup, I think is overly optimistic. We do need policies, and laws at their best are simply a codification of publicly held morals. It's really the way the state reflects the values of its own society. And it is our job as citizens to not just consume, but to ensure that our governments do reflect our values. And I simply don't know anyone who thinks that it's okay for a supermarket to cancel an order on Kenyan farmers who have grown peas and beans for that supermarket and leave those farmers with the crop unpaid for, simply because that supermarket has found cheaper beans somewhere else, meaning that the food has gone to waste in a country with millions of hungry people in it who don't eat the same kinds of foods as us, and why should they? And you know, that sort of thing should be illegal, and it has been my mission over the last 20 years to make some of those things illegal, and with some success. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, that relationship between supermarkets and producers, where a lot of food waste was being where a lot of food waste was being generated because of order cancellations and those cosmetic standards, it was regulated through a law that I called for in my book, and which eventually was passed in 2013, called the Groceries Code Adjudicator Act. And that meant that it was illegal for a supermarket to cancel an order on a farmer, or indeed a factory, with the result that that producer wasted food at their own cost. At the very least, that cost should be shared, so that the supermarket was financially incentivized to avoid that waste, whereas before, being the more powerful entity within the supply chain, they could just wash their hands of the waste and the cost of it. And that law has been transformational in the relationship between UK producers and the supermarkets. If a supermarket breaks that rule, it's liable to fines of up to 1% of its turnover, which is a huge corporate fine, and serves as a deterrent against, as well as the reputational harm that would result from that. The US has always had, actually, well, always, for much longer than any of the European countries apart from France, a very proactive, food redistribution, pro-companionship, if you like, set of policies. It's had the Good Samaritan Act, which protects companies from donating food in the event that anyone sues them, which, by the way, no one ever has successfully sued a company for donating food in good faith. But nevertheless, companies get nervous about it, even though it's completely unreasonable to get nervous about it, because it's never happened. But the law is there to protect, to give companies the confidence that they won't be sued if the food in some way causes food poisoning. So that's the first thing. Then there is a tax incentive. There's a tax break on any food that's been donated. And these are federal laws, not state laws. And more recently, I mean, I went to see Shelley Pingree back in 2000, and was it 14, 15? Definitely by 2016, these federal laws against food waste were being drafted, and they were really ambitious and really inspiring. And we're looking at not just the avoid sending to landfill part of the equation, but how do we ensure that food service companies, supermarkets, and the rest of businesses in the supply chain are incentivized and given confidence to redistribute surplus food? How do we encourage individuals to do what they can to avoid food waste and at the very last resort compost food that can't be used for human consumption? How do we encourage food waste to be redistributed for livestock if it's not fit for human consumption? Can we feed our pigs and our chickens with it? And these are things that the states across the USA are now, as you say, rightly taking up as things that they can do to improve the resilience of their food system, to improve the access of food for the least advantaged in society, to reduce the pollution and the cost of sending all of this waste to landfill, and instead to produce fertile compost and other residues for farmers to grow their food from. It's such an obvious area where food policy, where government policy can have a really positive impact. One of the big laws that is being considered here in the United Kingdom recently is mandatory food waste reporting for large food companies. I think this would be a huge step if companies were made to do what some of the big companies already do voluntarily, like Tesco, one of the top 5 retailers in the world, which publishes on an annual basis how much food it wastes. And this allows us to see which of the companies are doing better. It allows us to learn from those companies how best to tackle the food waste. And I think if all big companies were made to do the same, there would be a level playing field and everyone would compete to get to the bottom of the list, as it were, the least wasteful food company. So I think there's a lot of innovation. I think it is the most powerful thing. And I think governments around the world should be looking at each other's policy packages and learning from each other how best to implement the food waste reduction measures that we all need to see.
And I was recently reviewing the Chinese food waste law that was passed in 2021. They have some pretty interesting fines in their act. They're fining caterers for encouraging people to overorder. They are fining food service providers who waste large amounts of food. And this is my favorite one. I want to know what you think about this one. There's fines up to about $15,000 USD for broadcasters and online streaming personalities who distribute videos depicting binge eating or competitive eating. What do you think about that one? Can we make that global?
Well, I think one thing I'm not a massive fan of is shaming people around food practices. I'm not myself. Well, yeah, I'll quote Jesus, who said, eat and essentially this idea that food laws should become kind of ways of creating taboos that make people feel ashamed. I kind of feel the same way about veganism. It's fine to be vegan, but if you then think that everyone who's not vegan is somehow bad, because they drink some milk occasionally or pick up a roadkill deer or occasionally indulge in a bit of meat. I don't think that being shamed for food practices is necessarily a very inspiring way of creating change. I would rather use the cultural tools we have. You talk about celebrity chefs, and we never threaten anyone with being fined for doing it, but you can make it kind of, just bad taste to encourage people to waste food or eat more than is healthy. And I think you can do that without shaming and fining. I think you can do that with inspiring and sharing best practice. I'm also not entirely sure that it's just not where I would start. If you look just over the water into Japan, they have a food waste recycling law. They have done for years and years and years. And farmers are actually incentivized to collect food waste and feed it to their livestock, thus producing a kind of virtuous closed loop for food waste. And I think those approaches are good. But listen, I mean, within the Chinese context, who am I to say? I don't know. Anything that works, and I certainly will be watching with a lot of interest how effective these approaches are. One of my hats is that I sit on the United Nations Champions Group of Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, which is the goal to halve food waste by 2030. And it is one of the main things that I and my colleagues at Feedback and others are pressing, is that we should be looking at producing a national database of government policies that are designed to tackle food waste, establishing the data around their effectiveness, and learning without assuming that you can just, having campaign on food waste in literally scores of different countries around the world. I know that each and every campaign had to be tailor-made for the different culture in which we were operating. You cannot assume, even just 30 miles away over in France, that the same messages are going to work over there, let alone 3,000 miles away on the other side of the planet. So I think they're culturally specific around food practices and food waste, and sensitive to the different communities that exist, is an important part of any food policy package.
And that's exactly why I brought that example up, because I was reading the Champions 12.3 report, and I happen to be the director of the SDG Action Alliance at the University of South Florida. So I live and breathe the SDGs every day. And I'm always talking about 12.3.1, reducing food waste and food loss. And those are different issues along the continuum of the food system. And I encourage everyone to take a look at that report. There's some really impressive statistics. So kudos to you for being a champion 12.3. So I'm going to transition now to some of the questions from the audience. So we'll be pulling some questions out of the Q&A box. And the first one is, how can we make large-scale composting systems accessible? For waste is inevitable, so we need to tackle this. So what are your thoughts on that, large-scale composting?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's a really big opportunity. I mean, first thing to say is, of course, organic waste related to the food system, banana skins, eggshells, the outer leaves of a cabbage, those are absolutely the prime material that wants to go into compost. And anyone who has access to a compost bin of their own, or food waste collection systems at a municipal level, should be putting that kind of stuff into the compost. It's a very different thing if you throw a whole banana into your compost bin. That is a waste of food. It will inevitably happen, but I think I just want to distinguish between inevitable, genuinely inevitable food-related waste, the organic waste, and avoidable food waste, which is the waste of food that would otherwise have been eaten. But how to make that centralized system accessible for all? Well, I think some of the food waste policies that we've just been talking about that are being passed in different states of the US are replicating some of the policies that have been in place in Europe for quite some time, where we have a whole package of policies that encourage the diversion of food waste from landfill and into composting, into anaerobic digestion, and other alternative methods of recycling food waste. And those policies can be anything from a tax on sending food waste to landfill, which we have, a landfill tax escalator, it's what it's called in the United Kingdom, to incentives for, in fact, one translates into the other, incentives for the industries that are in a position to compost on a commercial scale. And then it's up to local authorities to put in place collection systems to take food waste, literally door to door, to those municipal food waste collection and processing sites. So I think that state intervention is the best way of doing that. I don't think the value of compost by itself will ever pay for the cost of door-to-door food waste collection. I think that is a public service that is provided, and at the moment is provided. Everyone's food waste is collected; it's just combined with everything else. So it's right that the taxpayer, essentially local taxes, should be supporting that sort of thing. So I think you do need state or local level buy-in to make door-to-door collections of food waste viable. I think all I want to say about that.
Yeah, I think public-private partnerships are the way that has to go, because they're already picking up the waste, as you say, but there needs to be an extra element coming in there. And there's no reason that people can't be composting themselves. You don't need a very large area, and biodigesters add another readily available way for people to take care of their own waste. And now there are all of those different machines that do it on your countertop if people want to go that way. So we do need the municipalities to step up, but until they do, we need to compost ourselves, that's for sure. So Ellen from Miami, she says, please elaborate on not having to give up our burgers and cheese. This conversation about change that must happen involves giving up. It makes it very difficult to have these conversations. How do you manage yours when it comes to these food items?
So how do I manage the conversation about giving up meat and dairy products? Oh, well, I uninvited made about half my talk on food waste on that subject. So that's kind of the way I do that. I think that I think particularly in the USA, the subject of reducing meat and dairy production has been an issue that environmental organizations have been very, very wary of for a very long time, having campaigned in partnership with environmental NGOs all over the world, including in the USA. I find that in the US there is a very acute sensitivity on the part of environmental organizations to tell their followings that we really do need to reduce meat and dairy products. And the reason for that is people are very attached to their burgers and their cheese, and they don't want to hear that we really ought to be reducing our consumption of those things. Myself, I prefer to speak the truth and to acknowledge that if we continue to chop down the Amazon rainforest at the rate that we do, for the purposes of producing beef in the way that we do, if we continue to intensively farm soy and other grains and keep animals in feedlots, there are a number of very, very negative outcomes that are already and will continue to derive from that system. I've mentioned deforestation, species extinction, global warming, pollution of waterways. I haven't mentioned, though it is very important to acknowledge that intensive meat production is where most antibiotics are being used in the world, and this is resulting in the production of antibiotic resistant diseases that will come back and bite us very, very hard. And all of these things derive from the meat and dairy industry and are much, much worse than the frankly quite painless exercise of reducing our meat consumption, because the plant world offers such a humongous variety. I challenge anyone in the world to have tried every different plant that they could eat. It hasn't happened. And trying different foods that are not as environmentally negatively impactful is a wonderful, tasty way of practicing good companionship. There's so much good food, and I think again, chefs and peers are a great benefit. But I also think, and I'm emphasize this, I think that just making it sound like meat and dairy products are bad is not the way. I myself have a herd of cows. And the herd of cows are doing an environmental service. They manage a heathland nature reserve, and they preserve that heathland habitat for the rare birds that need that heathland that has been there for thousands of years. They're doing an environmental service. The fact that they're also going to produce a bit of beef is an environmentally positive way of producing food. I've always kept pigs and chickens, and they eat food waste that would otherwise do nothing. Getting supermarket food waste that's going to go to landfill and turning that into pork and eggs and chicken is an environmentally friendly way of producing meat and dairy products, and recognizing that, albeit on a smaller scale than is currently practiced, we can produce environmentally beneficial meat and dairy products, and that we should enjoy those and celebrate them if you want to, not obviously if you don't want to, but people shouldn't be made to feel guilty for wanting to keep that as part of their dietary practice.
Especially dairy production, there's so many different ways to engage with that we just can't say, dairy is inherently bad. So that's an excellent point that you make. And In terms of pasturing, we know now that regenerative agriculture has really taken hold in sectors here in the US. And not only does it sequester carbon and promote ecosystem services, but it's better for the animals. And, some might be cold for meat. That's true. It's all about how are we doing these things. That's for sure. And Ellen also notes that she lived in Canada last summer, the potato capital of the universe, as she states. And she lived next to a field where the potatoes were just left on the field. And she is asking what the constraints are of folks just walking onto the fields and collecting the potatoes. We don't advocate that, Ellen. But she wants to know, how do you start a gleaning project in the places where we live?
Yeah, I mean, I remember starting it myself for very, very similar reasons. First, you need the permission of the farmer. Gleaning used to be something that was just universally practiced, and when a farmer had finished the harvest, after that, people who needed it would go in and glean what they can. Those days are over, and I think you might get an irate farmer coming after you if you just kind of walk on and with an army of volunteers and start digging, even though you might be morally in the right. So getting the farmer's permission, giving them the confidence that you're not going to go and damage other crops or injure yourselves or cause other kinds of trouble is a good thing. And therefore working with an environmental organization that has some credentials can really, really help. And then mustering an army of volunteers, finding a good charity that needs that produce, and allowing volunteers to take home whatever they need for their own consumption is a great way of kind of engaging people in that process. And it really can be done on a very, very local level. And indeed, dozens and dozens of groups have popped up around Europe and the UK, just simply as a result of somebody like yourself getting a bit annoyed about what's going on in their community and organizing around that and finding other people who share that very, very same view and practicing good companionship and really enjoying it. And such a wonderful, wonderful way of spending an afternoon, particularly if you're the kind of person that spends most of your day in front of a computer.
And Matthew asks if it would be helpful if more people would engage in their own food production, either hunting or farming, so they become more aware of issues of food waste and production. Do we need more people gardening and hunting?
Yeah, of course. As soon as you've grown a vegetable, I'm just literally, I was a bit late coming to my computer because I was sowing all my spring veggies just now. And, that whole cycle of growing food, even on the tiniest scale, if you have only enough space to grow some herbs on a windowsill or get your kids growing them in the windowsills in their school, it's transformational to be involved in that whole cycle of food production. So anything like that. And yeah, hunting. I mean, I got an air rifle when I was a kid, and I went out shooting gray squirrels. These are non-native, they came from America, invasive species. They're really bad for trees in this area. They ring bark the trees. They're really bad for the native red squirrel because they're larger and they're territorial and they give them a disease. So shooting gray squirrels and eating them, and shooting rabbits and eating them, and pigeons and things like that was my way of interacting with the wild. I think we should be arming our youth with air rifles and sending them out, teaching them about what should and shouldn't be. And it's such a great way of reminding that there is no separation between us and nature. We are the ecosystem. We're part of it. We completely depend on it. The water from the oceans and the rivers flows through us. The plants that are harnessing the energy from the sun and turning it into their own biomatter that can then become our body and our energy and our smiles and our friendship and our hugs and our love, that all comes from the food that we eat. It's our way of putting the earth into our bodies on a daily basis. We are part of this system. There is no separation between humans and nature. This is the universe, it's the solar system, and we are just part of that. And I think being conscious of that by the way we eat, by the way we get our food, whether it's growing, whether it's hunting, whether it's scavenging roadkill on the roadside, whether it's just sharing food in a conscious way with your friends and with your family, this is how we can restore our relationship with our fellow humans and with Earth, with the nature that we share this beautiful green and blue planet with. And my God, you know, we need to do this, and we need to do it fast. The food system is currently one of the, as I've laid out, one of the main reasons why we are in the middle of the mass species extinction event that threatens the survival of most of the species on planet Earth, and which, if it continues to follow current trajectories, will result in the suffering of billions of humans as well. And we aren't doing anything about it half as fast as we need to. And I think that if we could start with the way we eat, the way we eat our food, we can show that this system is one that we can transform into a beautiful, restorative, nutritious, delicious, and loving way of interacting with the earth and each other.
Absolutely. What wonderful sentiments. And I'll leave us with one story of your sphere of influence that connected the two of us years ago, and here we are again. I saw your work in the film Wasted and was inspired about the bread and talked to the Fresh Initiative Supply Hub in Pinellas County. At the time, Scarlett Amy Wins was directing. I was like, hey, Scarlett, you have all this extra bread. Where is it going? Oh, well, we can't give it to the pantry. We have to throw it away. Like, oh, no, don't throw it away. Call up the USF Brewing Arts Program. And in 2019, they released their first batch of this. It was a brown ale called Bread High. And so I was inspired by you, and that led us to change what we're doing here. And so your work is just so inspirational. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for that story. That's really, really wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Brooke. It's been an inspiring conversation. Tristan, we value everything you do. I still remember the first time I ran into you, and this quote impacted me and really shook me to the core. So I wanted to just thank you for all the great work, and we look forward to connecting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.